I think a lot about body language and the way that we communicate with our bodies, with our limbs, and what it means to isolate different gestures or shapes and freeze them in a moment of transformation. We say so much without speaking, and with visual art, for me, it's always been trying to get at something that is hard to verbalize. It's trying to communicate something that you can only really communicate by making or by visualizing or by constructing. We are in my studio, which is in Beacon, New York, in a detached garage behind my home. I make sculptures using primarily recycled textiles and found objects. I source a lot of things from my own life or lives of friends and family to create compound sculptural forms. My work is about trying to capture all of the disparate pieces of being a person. I'm interested in trying to capture certain moods and gestures in my work and to speak to the body or a certain kind of creature that's in the process of doing something, morphing or changing, kind of catching it in that state. I'm trying to question this idea of flattening or characterizing a person, trying to show that there's so much that we all contain, that they can all coexist together. When I'm in the studio, it's a lot about making visual connections, putting pieces together that you wouldn't necessarily put together, or something that I hadn't necessarily planned out, but once I see them together, they make so much sense. I'm much more engaged when I don't know what's going to happen. I started in this place where I was making these really specific kinds of textile pieces that were in the language of painting. And then they very gradually became these forms that fell off the wall and came onto the floor and started to occupy space. And as they started to do that, I started thinking about armatures and ways that they can hold themselves up or not to kind of create more dynamism in the way that they are in the space. Especially with my freestanding sculptures, there's something about the way you encounter them as a kind of one-to-one relationship in a space. It kind of creates this feeling of almost empathy or this relationship between you and the work, even though it is kind of a mysterious thing. You do feel like you have this knowledge of it because of the way that it is holding shape, the way that it's standing, its posture. The idea of things in the home, in your life, taking on bodies, taking on personalities, becoming these things that can stand and can emote. There's something in that for me. All of these things coming together aesthetically and literally kind of compounding together to create a new body, a new form that's kind of in the process of coming together. The patchworking that I do kind of speaks to that, juxtaposing different patterns and textures that you wouldn't necessarily put together, like this idea of them clashing. But I find that to be actually really generative. It allows me to do something visual that is hard to communicate verbally, putting all of these visual pieces together and seeing them stitched together. I tend to use a very kind of visible stitch. That is my form of mark making, and I like the idea of it being also a visual element as well as a functional technique that I'm using. There's something about that motion, that movement, that feels just so literal and tangible to me. To have learned this process in the home space from women in my family, it feels really personal and is something that has kind of been this thread that has been in my life since childhood. I like the idea of bringing that in and speaking to those kinds of processes that we learn as children or things that we learn at home and how they are just as important as more formal considerations, and that they can be just so visually and materially complex and compelling and meaningful. The idea of these works being created in my studio and living with me and then going on to find a new home and a new life feels like this really natural next step for them after they've kind of taken on their forms. The idea of them almost walking out of the studio onto their next life feels really right and kind of poetic to me. Sometimes I think about certain works in my studio that I've exhibited in different places, and then maybe they go to live with a collector, and the idea of these pieces that are created from so many different recycled materials or found objects, things that have already had a life, and then they're coming together in this new way. And then maybe as this new form, they kind of have this new life where they travel and then where they live. It just kind of makes this sense to me and just feels like, I don't know, they're on this journey or something.